Oh, hold on. Dang it. What the heck?
Just mute my mic.
That's okay. What did I just do? Oh my gosh, I'm so silly. I think we're streaming. I forgot there's certain things that I can't put in as far as digits or characters. Now, let's try that again. Okay, I need to be able to record this as well. So we're actually streaming. So we'll just skip that music altogether. Welcome back, everybody. Torah Talk Weekly Parshat Shelach. Welcome to have our dear friend Rabbi Rafi Mollot back in with us today, live, no recording. And so a really excellent Torah Parsha this week. Parshat Shelach. I actually have it on my YouTube description for you all for later on, which is going to be in, where'd he go? There it is right there. Oh, it's actually on the screen. Okay, good. I wasn't sure I actually had it all on the screen for you, but it is actually there, so we are good. All right. Well, Rabbi, I'll let you have it and give us a few of your thoughts. We'd certainly appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, William. Thank you for having me back.
Very welcome.
I had my week off last week, so here I am refreshed.
Yay.
Parshat Shelach. The section of Shelach takes its name from the opening of the section where essentially Moshe is commanded to send Shelach lecha anashim. Shelach in Hebrew means send. Send men into the land of Israel to spy out the land. Here, the Jewish people have come to the edge of the promised land. They're about to enter, and they send spies ahead. Now, why did they do this? Why not just say, listen, God, you want us to go in? We're going to go in. So we're going to see. What's interesting, it was the people's own lack of faith, their own failing in faith in God that caused this to happen. Now, what's very interesting to see is that when the section opens, the Parsha opens, it just, God says, send men into the land, and there doesn't seem to be any precursor. But if we look in the book of Deuteronomy, in the first chapter, and I put the citation somewhere in my notes, but I don't have it in front of me right now. But in the first chapter of Deuteronomy, when Moses is recounting the events that took place in the desert, he says actually something a little different than we find in the book of Numbers, which is that the people came to him and said, we want you to send spies. So and essentially Moshe took it back to Hashem and he said, okay, go ahead and do it. So the opening, send for yourself spies, really follows an event that is not recorded in this part of the text, but is recorded later, that the Jews came first. So you see it to a certain degree, they asked for it. And why did they ask for it? So like we said, because clearly they were lacking something in their faith in Hashem, that they were willing and ready to just go in without any kind of scouting out of the land first. Now, you don't have to interpret it that way. In other words, the other way to interpret it is to say, of course we accept that this is the promised land and Hashem is sending us in there and we're going to do it. But, we just want to know what we're in for. We need to prepare psychologically. We need to prepare maybe strategies for war. So just go send scouts so we have the information that we need to know what preparations to make to go in. But not that there was ever any doubt that they would actually go in. That's one way to look at it. However, it's not so apparent that that's the case, because one of the things that when Moshe says, go and check out the land, he says, go to see if it's good or bad, right? That's one of the things that he says to see. Go see if it's good or bad. Now, what's the point of seeing whether it's good or bad? God said to go, then you go, whether it's good or it's bad. All you could do coming back and saying it's bad is to make people feel bad about the thing they're about to get. So why would you even put that up for discussion? Now, the simple answer to that is that Moshe was very confident that this land, which is flowing with milk and honey, that offered so much promise, certainly the report of the spies could only be a good thing. In other words, you could come somewhat sight unseen into something and go, I don't know what I'm into, but God, I trust you. You can have that on the one hand. But if you open that door and say, well, let's go see what it is, if it's good or bad. On the one hand, the report could come back and say, it's good, it's awesome, it's great. And then it relieves some of the trepidation that, like, I don't know what I'm in for. There's a little bit of anxiety there. Even if you accept the command of God, even if you're going to totally listen to God, you know what you have to do. There's no question about it. But I don't know what I'm in for. I'm feeling a little bit of anxiety just because I'm not sure what to expect. So to send spies, and Moshe says, go see if it's good or bad. Of course, you're going to come back and say it's good. Like, there's no question about it. And it relieves some of that anxiety. So there was some value seen when the people came and said, send spies ahead. There was a way to look at that in a positive light. And God even greenlights it, although it seems like it wasn't part of God's original plan. And based on what happens at the end, we know it would have been better off if they hadn't done it. But the people come to Moshe, they say, send us spies. And Moshe gets the green light from God, go ahead and send the spies. And he even says, go and see if it's good or bad. Why would Moshe say such a thing? Again, because he was so confident that it would be good. So if so, what went wrong? What went wrong? What went wrong? Now, before we answer the question of what went wrong, let's talk about what happened. So they end up sending spies, one from each tribe. So 12 spies go all together, subtracting the tribe of Levi. Levi is not counted over here. Now remember, we always count 12 tribes, even though technically you could say there's 13. But for some reason, the number 12 is so significant that we always identify the Jewish nation as a nation of 12 tribes. And that is as follows. Sometimes we count the tribe of Levi, and we count the tribe of Levi, then Joseph is counted as one tribe. Sometimes we put Levi aside, they're separate because they sort of have a separate destiny. And we count Joseph as two tribes because Joseph, his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, each got an ancestral inheritance. So there really were 12 portions of the land. Levi didn't get an inheritance in the land. They were supported by the tithes, etc. So here we have one from each tribe, just clarifying that's not counting the tribe of Levi. And they go into the land and they scout out the land for 40 days. Now, while this is going on, or I should say even before it goes on, it seems that Moses, had some type of a premonition that there was something nefarious about the scheme of some of these spies. And so therefore he says he changes the name of Hoshea bin Nun. Hoshea, the son of Nun, he changes his name to Yehoshua, adding on a Yud, one of the letters of God's name, to sort of strengthen Yehoshua with a godliness that would keep him protected from whatever nefarious plot might evolve. So among the 12 tribes that go, we have Yehoshua on the one hand. On the other hand, we have Kalev ben Yefuneh, Caleb, the son of, I don't know what it is in English, Jephunneh. Kalev ben Yefuneh from the tribe of Judah. Yehoshua, Joshua from the tribe of Ephraim, and the 10 other spies. And they go in, and 10 of them seem to return with an evil report, while Kalev from Judah and Joshua from Ephraim, they return with a good report. 10 with an evil report, 2 with a good report. Now, among the things that they bring back is they bring back these giant-sized fruits. They go there and they find this giant cluster of grapes, which needed to be carried by several men. According to our understanding of the text, it was carried by 8 men, and then there were 2 others. One carried all by himself a giant fig, and one carried a giant, I believe it was a pomegranate. So 10 of them come carrying this big giant fruit, and they see these giant inhabitants, and they see these fortified cities, and they come back, and they start out saying something good, because you always want to start out saying like what the people want to hear, and then they start listening to you, and then you can get in your biases and your equivalences. So they come back and they say, oh, we came to this land and it's such a rich land. Look at this giant fruit over here. And but then suddenly they turn the good into the bad. You see here where Moshe was sure that they would come back with a good report. Of course they would come back with a good report. But you see that there's a way that a person could even turn what's good into what's bad. A person could look at something bad and find something good in it, and a person could look at something good and find something bad in it. And here the Torah, one of the lessons we learn, we see right away, is the Torah teaches us that even the very best things, if we have a negative perspective on it, it becomes something awful. You could poison even the best stuff in life. Like our rabbis teach us, who is rich? The one who's happy with his lot. If a person has, I don't know if you could even say this, objectively very little, but to him, he values it very greatly. So he is happy. He feels like a rich person. But you could have a person with millions upon millions of dollars, but isn't satisfied with it, is constantly looking for more than what he has, makes him poor because he looks at it as not sufficient. We have the ability in our lives to look at what we have in a good way and make it good and make our lives good just with the perspective of our eye, or to look at something good and make it horrible and awful. So Moshe, with a certain naivete, said, of course the land is good. Go see if it's good or bad. Of course they're going to see that it's good. But what did they do? They came back and they said, yeah, the land's good. It's so rich. Look at this giant fruit. But you know what this giant fruit tells us? This is giant fruit for giant inhabitants, because the inhabitants of the land are so big and so mighty and so strong. Then how could we mere mortals possibly go up against these giant people? And Moshe even said, go look if the cities are fortified or not. Well, if they're fortified cities, that would seem to be a negative, because it would mean that it's hard to break in. But Moshe's point was the opposite. He said you could look at a fortified city and say, why are these people building these big, tall walls over here? Because they're afraid, because they're weaklings. And the only way they know how to survive is to build big walls. But to build big walls is maybe a sign of weakness. If you see fortified cities, you see a sign of weakness. And if you see open cities, you see cities that are ripe for the conquest. But here the spies came back with the opposite. They said the fortified cities, we're not going to be able to break in. And the open cities, oh my goodness, open cities, they don't even bother building walls because the inhabitants are so confident in their might as warriors that they must be extremely mighty. So no matter what you look at, you could find a way to interpret it in a negative way. So here's Moshe, like, go and see all the good of the land. And they saw the good, but they twisted the good to be evil. But meanwhile, Caleb, and Joshua come back and they saw it in a good light, and they're trying to convince the people, no, it's good, no, it's good, no, it's good. But unfortunately, as one might expect, the group of 10 held sway over the people, and they persuaded the people that in fact going into the land of Israel was going to be a disaster. And the people began to cry, and they began to mourn, and they began to lament, and they began to complain. And they said, why did you take, as we heard this refrain many times throughout the sojourn in the desert, why did you take us out of Egypt to kill us in the desert? We would have been better off remaining in Egypt. Let's appoint a new leader over ourselves. Let's return to Egypt where we came from. And it says that night, this is so that story was in chapter 13. Then we find in chapter 14, it says that night they went back to their tents and they cried. Now our rabbis make a clever calculation based on clues in the text that we can pinpoint exactly what date on the calendar this was. And the night on the calendar where this took place was the night of the Hebrew date Tish'a B'Av, which means the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av. It was on that night that they went and cried in their tents over something they shouldn't have cried over. And they rejected the land of Israel that God had brought them to. And in so doing, they were rejecting God. They were rejecting God's leadership. They were rejecting God's truth and faith in God by saying this was a terrible calamity. And so our rabbis tell us that night they cried for a reason they shouldn't have cried. And Hashem said, as a result of this night will be set in history as a night that you will have a reason to cry. And those who know that the reason that Hebrew date is so significant, the 9th of Av, is that it's the date of the destruction of both the first temple and the second temple. Meaning, before we even get there, but immediately there's a decree. God decrees. Now, first he says, I want to destroy the whole nation. And Moshe intercedes like he does so many times in the past. And he begs God's forgiveness. And to a certain degree, there is a teshuvah, there is a repentance, and there is a forgiveness, but only partially, to the point where God decrees that corresponding to each day that the spies went through the land to bring their evil report and to bring this calamity will be 1 year of wandering in the desert. This generation, declares God, will not enter the land of Israel because you've rejected it. So you're going to wander in the desert, and rather the next generation will come in. So who was the decree upon? The men from the ages 20 to 60 who had been counted in the previous sections, who had been counted as part of the men fitting to go to war. This was the congregation that would be decreed not to enter the land, but rather anyone 20 and younger would enter the land. Now, by the way, we see from here, this is a source where we find the teaching that a person is not liable for sins committed before the age of 20, is not liable to punishment by heaven. It's an interesting idea. Until the age of 20, a person is not liable to punishment by heaven. A person is liable to punishment in an earthly court from the age of 13 on, at least by Jewish law. A man from the age of 13 and a woman from the age of 12 becomes what's called bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, meaning they become obligated in the commandments, including the corporal punishments or even capital punishments that might come from the court. And I'd like to address the subject of capital punishment in this class, hopefully, if I manage my time well, which comes up later on in the Parsha. So, but meanwhile, the generation from under 20 is not subject to the decree, meaning, yes, they will wander in the desert for 40 years, but they are the ones who will enter at the end of 40 years. When they are grown and they have children and grandchildren, that nation will enter. But the present 20 to 60 will not enter. They'll wander for 40 years until that generation dies out, as indeed does take place. So this is the decree that's made. Now, furthermore, so like I said, the decree that the generation should essentially die out in the desert and not enter the land was decreed that night on the 9th of Av, but it was set in history forever, so that after the Jews did enter the land of Israel and did ultimately build the temple, and the temple stood for 410 years, it was destroyed ultimately. Of course, that's the whole story of the Tanakh, of the story of the Jewish people in their land underneath the kings, in the books of the prophets, etc., until ultimately their sins lead to the destruction of the temple. And the destruction occurs on the 9th of Av, that very same night. And then they go into Babylonian exile for 70 years. And they return after 70 years and rebuild the temple. The second temple stands for 420 years. And again, there's a destruction once again on the 9th of Av. Now, not only that, the Mishnah at the end of Tractate Ta'anis tells us of 5 tragedies that occurred on this date, Tisha B'Av. Number 1 was what occurred in our Parsha, the decree that this generation would not enter the land of Israel, the destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the second temple, the fall of Beitar. I'll just explain a little bit about that. After the destruction of the second temple, the Jews were carried into Roman exile. However, there remained still some of the Jewish population in the land of Israel under Roman rule, and it was a harsh and brutal rule. And about 60 years after the destruction of the second temple, there arose we'll call him a messianic figure. Now, that's not who you think it is, but maybe it is who you think it is. There arose a messianic figure who's known to history as Bar Kokhba, Shimon Bar Kokhba. That was not his real name. Bar Kokhba means the son of the star, and it's meant to it's meant to be a reference. This was his nickname because of the verse, "A star shall come forth from Jacob," which refers to the Messiah, that they named him Bar Kochba, the son of the star, so to speak, that he was the messianic person, individual that they were waiting for, because he waged a war against Rome. This was, I believe, known as the Great Rebellion, where he waged a war against the Romans around the year 135. And he was greatly successful for a number of years, to the point that he even recaptured Jerusalem. He made Jerusalem the capital of an independent Jewish state for a short time. They minted their own coins, the Bar Kokhba coins that they found. And it seemed like the Jews had finally regained their independence, and it was coming up to 70 years from the destruction of the Second Temple. So people were thinking, just like the gap between the First and Second Temples was 70 years. Here we're coming up to 70 years. We're going to have a third temple. Archaeological discoveries have indeed shown that there was already some construction on the third temple begun by Bar Kokhba, whose real name was Bar Koseva. We have his letters. Archaeology has discovered his letters signed by his hand. Shimon Bar Koseva was his real name, although the rabbis had a different nickname for him. The sages who were contemporaneous with him, famously Rabbi Akiva, the famous Rabbi Akiva, whose story we won't go into right now, actually endorsed Bar Kokhba as Messiah. He said, "I believe he is the true Messiah," and he did endorse him. And he was the greatest rabbi of his generation. So, of course, that led many to follow. However, the majority of sages of his generation did not agree with him, and they did not endorse Bar Kokhba, and they actually gave him a nickname of Bar Koziva. Bar Koziva means kozev in Hebrew, means something that is dishonest, something that is deceitful. They called him the son of deceit because they felt that his pretension to be the Messiah was in fact a deceit. So his real name was Bar Koseva. Those who followed him nicknamed him Bar Kokhba, the son of the star. But the sages in their majority named him Bar Koseva, the son of deceit. Now, the Talmud records that his downfall was he became maybe more the son of conceit, because he became so conceited with his victories over the Romans, which really were very impressive. Perhaps the greatest military victories over Rome in history till that time, that he began to sing a song with his men, like you could imagine, like a little military song. I don't know what I'm into. I don't know exactly, but essentially the lyrics went something like this, paraphrasing, but, God, we don't need your help to win, just don't get in our way. Meaning, God, if you would help our enemy, we would certainly lose, but we are mighty enough to win on our own. And it is almost like God's response to this new level of arrogance was, "Oh yeah, we'll see about that." And at that point, he began to lose. And he lost and lost and lost all of his gains. He was pushed out of Jerusalem until his final stronghold was the city of Beitar. And the last stand, like the Alamo, the last stand of Bar Kokhba's rebellion, this hopeful rebellion, this messianic endeavor that the Jews were so hopeful was going to end in the redemption and the bringing of the third temple, ended up, it's a long story that I'll make short, ended up ultimately with the falling of the city of Beitar. And so the final nail in the coffin of Bar Kokhba's rebellion was on Tisha B'Av, when the city of Beitar fell. So that was another occurrence. And the last occurrence that's mentioned in the Mishnah, it says, is the plowing over of the city of Jerusalem. After this ignominious defeat, the city of Jerusalem was plowed over like a field. Now, I'm not sure actually if it was after Bar Kokhba or before, but I don't have that information. But at some point, the Romans did plow over Jerusalem like a field. And that was in fulfillment of the verse in Micah, which I don't have the citation for, that Sion Sades Techaresh, Zion will be plowed over like a field. And that also was like a death knell in the hope of the people for the city of Jerusalem. And that was, again, that took place on the 9th of Av. And post-Mishnaic, the Mishnah, which was compiled in the 2nd century, we have other famous tragedies that occurred on Tisha B'Av throughout history. One which is very interesting is that the Spanish expulsion, people know about the Spanish Inquisition. The Jews were forced to leave Spain if they would not convert to Christianity. And the day of the expulsion from Spain, they said, Jews out or we're going to kill you, was the 9th of Av. Now, the Spanish didn't plan it that way, but the day that it occurred was, in fact, the 9th of Av. And we have interestingly, a journal entry in the diary of Christopher Columbus, who many believe was what they call a Marrano Jew. The Marrano Jews were Jews who, crypto Jews. They outwardly converted to Christianity in order to remain in Spain, but secretly kept Jewish traditions. And there is a theory that Christopher Columbus and his 3 ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, if I'm saying that right, were actually crewed just about exclusively with these crypto Jews. Now, I didn't do this research. There was a person who wrote a whole book on this, that if you look at the crew manifests, these were all Jewish families who had converted to Christianity, and that what Christopher Columbus was really trying to do was to bring the Jews to refuge where they could be free from Spanish persecution. Now, that's a cute idea. The reason it falls flat a little bit is because he didn't do that. In other words, we don't find that Christopher Columbus and his crew, when they found the Americas, ended up, creating a Jewish colony over there. So I'm skeptical of his theory, but there is such a theory. But what's interesting is that Christopher Columbus's journey coincided with the expulsion from Spain, that he was supposed to embark on his famous journey to the New World on the day that the expulsion took place, but he couldn't leave the port because it was too full of ships of the Jews being expelled. And he actually writes this in his journal, that he wasn't able to depart on his planned departure day because of the volume of ships that were occupying the water that were leaving, taking the Jews out of Spain. So he ended up leaving later than that. But that expulsion date was also the 9th of Av, another great tragedy in Jewish history. There are others that we won't go through. However, I'll say this. The 9th of Av has been essentially placed in the Jewish calendar as the day of remembrance for all Jewish tragedies throughout history. So every year to this date, for those who don't know, Jews on the 9th of Av will fast. It's a full 25-hour fast, meaning from sunset in the evening till the next evening at the what do you call, nightfall. So it's 24 hours plus to the twilight time. So it's about 25 hours where Jews will fast. We sit on the floor and we have other morning rituals. Among them, we say something called kinos, and kinos are lamentations. And we have about 50 lamentations that have been collected over the millennia, over the thousands of years of Jewish history, from different communities at different times that went through tragedies and destructions and persecutions, and recorded the record of their tragedy in these lamentations. And we recite the entire book of Lamentations. It's not the book of Lamentations in the Bible. That's called Eicha in Hebrew. We also recite Eicha on the 9th of Av. We also recite the biblical book of Lamentations. But we have a separate book of post-biblical lamentations that have been collected for all the calamities that befell the Jewish people through 2,000 years of history. And we read them all throughout Tisha B'Av. And we sort of remember all the communities that suffered and all the suffering of Jewish history throughout time on the day of Tisha B'Av. And it all began, this day of tragedy, it is the day of Jewish tragedy. And it all began with the mission of the spies and their return giving an evil report, which we're going to talk more about. But also to put that in perspective, is by the same token that it says that we fast on this day, if we look in the book of Zechariah, chapters 7 and 8, the Jewish people ask Zechariah about continuing these fast days that they had taken on during the period of the Second Temple, and whether or not the fasts remained in place or not. And so there are 4 fast days mentioned, which Jews still fast to this day. And they are the fast of the 7th month, which is in the month of Tishrei, the Hebrew month of Tishrei. We have the Fast of Gedalia, which commemorates a certain tragedy in Jewish history. Maybe I'll discuss what that is. We have the Fast of the 10th month, which is the 10th day of Teves, where that is where we commemorate the surrounding of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar and his army before the destruction of the temple. Jerusalem was surrounded on the 10th of Teves. We commemorate that with a fast. We have the 17th day of the month of Tammuz. That's the fast of the 4th month. And that commemorates the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem before the temple was destroyed. The walls of Jerusalem were breached, and there were 3 weeks of calamity and destruction between the 17th of Tammuz and then the 9th of Av, which is the destruction of the temple itself. And that's called the fast of the 5th month, which is Av. Now, going back to what I call the fast of the 7th month, which is known as the Fast of Gedalia, that happened latest in history, that even after the destruction of the first temple, the Jewish people were allowed to a certain degree, aside from those who were exiled to Babylonia, to keep a population in the land of Israel, governed by a righteous governor named Gedalia, who was appointed by the Babylonians. This righteous governor, Gedalia, was assassinated by Jewish assassins. According to tradition, this occurred on Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the month of Tishrei. We push off the fast until after the holiday, so it comes out on the 3rd day of Tishrei. Every year we fast the fast of Gedalia. Now, those are the 4 fasts on the Jewish calendar, aside from the biblical fast of Yom Kippur, the 10th day of Tishrei. I'm not talking about that because that's obviously always obligatory. But the Jews ask Zechariah, what about the other so-called minor fasts in the wake of the fact that the temple is rebuilt? This is during the Second Temple period. Do we have to observe them? Zechariah essentially answers them to make a long answer short. He answers them yes, that they are required because there is still an exile. Even during the Second Temple period, the majority of the Jewish people remained outside the land of Israel. But he says, but in the future there will come a day, he says, where all 4 of these fast days will become days of joy. All 4 fast days will become days of joy. That is the fast commemorating the surrounding of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, the fast commemorating the breaching of the walls, the fast commemorating the destruction of the temple itself, the fast commemorating the assassination of Gedalia. All these 4 fast days that we commemorate yearly as days of tragedy, we will one day commemorate them as days of great joy. Now, why should that be? Why should they become days of great joy? I was going to save this idea for later, but I'll just tease it a little bit now. Because everything that happens in our lives, this is a very big subject that I'm truncating into a short soundbite because I want to get on with the summary of the events in the Parsha, and then we'll come back to some more ideas. But everything that happens in our lives happens for a reason. It's all guided by God. Everybody knows this. What I'm saying is not anything new, but it pays to hear it again. Even the tragic events in our lives are ordained by God. And they're all meant ultimately for a good purpose. There's a famous story. Maybe I will go on a tangent after all. There's a famous story in the Talmud about a person named Nachum Ish Gamzu. Nachum Ish Gamzu, it says he was called Ish Gamzu, which means man of Gamzu. Why was he called man of Gamzu? Because this fellow Nachum used to always say the words Gamzu Latova. Whenever a tragedy would strike, he would say Gamzu Latova, which means that this too is for the best. This too is for the best. He always looked at tragedy with a good eye. Like I said before, you could look at what's good and you could see it bad. You could look at what's bad and you could see it good. The spies looked at something good and they saw something bad, and that caused it to be bad. That brought the so-called ayin hara, the evil eye, upon it. If you look with an evil eye, you're going to bring the evil. But if you look with an ayin tova, with a good eye, you're going to bless that thing with good. Now, Nachum Ish Gamzu would always look at a thing good and say, this too is for the good, even if he couldn't see it. And the Gemara famously records a story that Nachum Ish Gamzu had to bring a tribute from the Jewish people to the Romans, and he had to go on a dangerous journey from the land of Israel to Rome. And there were always bandits along the way. It was dangerous. So they specifically sent to Nachum Ish Gamzu, who was a great, righteous, holy man, that they knew that he was worthy of that God should make a miracle for him, that he could bring the tribute to the Romans safely. If the Jews would not deliver the tribute, the Romans would, of course, punish them harshly. So as he's traveling, he brings this chest full of gold and jewels to a certain inn. And, the innkeeper says, what you got in the box over there? And he says, oh, just gold and jewels to bring to the Roman emperor. And the innkeeper says, oh, very interesting. Let me show you right to your room. I have a special suite for you, and he brings him in. And while Nachum Ish Gamzu is sleeping, the innkeeper, he's got this secret trap door, and he sneaks into the room, and he empties out the box of all the treasures, and he fills it instead with dirt, so that it should feel heavy for Nachum Ish Gamzu, that he's got this box full of dirt. And so Nachum Ish Gamzu, the next day, he lifts up his heavy chest full of dirt, and he puts it on his wagon, and he goes on his way to Rome. And when he gets there, he says, I am the Jewish emissary. I brought the tribute for the Roman emperor. And they bring him in front of the Roman emperor and says, let me present you with the Jewish tribute. And he opens the box, and it's a box full of dirt. And the Roman emperor, he's so incensed. He says, this is the insult that the Jews send me. They send me a box of dirt. He says, I'll have them all killed. And suddenly it says Elijah the prophet disguises himself as one of the Roman emperor's advisors, and he says, King, I heard about the Jew's ancestor Abraham, that he used to defeat his enemies in war with dirt, that he would throw dirt, and the dirt would turn into swords and spears. Now, this is based on a rabbinic tradition that Abraham was able to defeat the army of the four kings, the mighty army of the four kings in Genesis chapter 14. He's able to defeat them with dirt alone that was able to miraculously become arrows and spears. And that's a story for another time. So Elijah says, I heard that their ancestor had this miracle happen to them. Perhaps the Jews are giving you this magic dirt that is able to destroy your enemies. So he says, I will test it out on a region that's rebelling against me. And he goes and he takes this dirt and they test it out, and the miracle occurs, and the dirt turns into swords and spears, and it destroys the enemy. Now, if you'd like a more rationalistic take on this story, that's for another time, but let's take the story at face value for now. He comes back to Nachum Ish Gamzu. He says, I cannot thank you enough for this incredible gift. Oh, I skipped the most important part of the story. When he opens the box and he sees the dirt and he says, I'm going to kill all the Jews now, Nachum Ish Gamzu immediately says, Gamzu Latova. This too is for the good. Can you imagine? He insulted the Roman Empire. He wants to kill Nachum Ish Gamzu on the spot and eradicate the Jewish people. And he says, Gamzu Latova, this too is for the good, right? How could this be? But he said, this too is for the good. Anyway, so what happens. The Roman Emperor is very happy with this magic dirt. So he sends Nachum Ish Gamzu back to the Jewish people laden with treasures. And much more than he came with. And on the way back, he passes the same inn. And the innkeeper says, how are you still alive? I mean, how'd it go in Rome? And he says, you wouldn't believe it. I can't explain it, but I had this chest full of dirt, and it had this magic property. And the king was so happy, he sent me back with far more jewels and riches that I even came with. So the innkeeper says, oh, really? He paid that much for one chest of dirt. Imagine what he'll pay for 10. So the innkeeper quickly gets more dirt from his backyard, and he loads it up into many, many wagons, and he takes his whole caravan to Rome. He says, I brought you more magic dirt. You like the dirt that Nachum Ish Gamzu? We're going to love this. And he brings it to him, and the king says, great, let's go test that on a province. And they go out to war, and they throw the dirt. Nothing happens. The Roman army gets crushed. They come back to the king. They say it didn't work. And he has the innkeeper punished. The innkeeper's killed. And they all live happily ever after. So there's one famous example of Nachum Ish Gamzu, whose pupil was Rabbi Akiva, the famous Rabbi Akiva I spoke about before, who likewise has a story. He has a story that says that he was traveling and he comes to a town and he's looking for lodging and nobody would allow him to stay. They said, no, we don't have room for you. We don't have room. They were very inhospitable. So he has no choice but to sleep in the woods. So he's sleeping in the woods, and he says in different words, he says, everything God does is for a good reason. That's what he declares, because he remembers the lesson from his teacher, Nachum Ish Gamzu. Everything God does is for a good reason. And so he goes into the woods, and it says he has a donkey, a chicken and a candle. The candle for light, the donkey to ride on, and the chicken for a meal. Says as he's setting up his camp, whatever, a lion comes and eats his donkey. And he says, everything God does is for the best. At least I have my chicken and I have my candle. Suddenly a weasel comes and eats his chicken. And he goes, everything God does is for the best. At least I have my candle. A wind comes, blows out his candle. He says, everything God does is for the best. He goes to sleep cold in the dark. The next day, he walks back into town and he sees that the town's been ransacked. And there's dead people all over and houses on fire. And he says, what happened over here? And they said in the night there came a marauding army. A marauding army came through and they wrecked our whole village. And Rabbi Akiva says, look at the kindness of God over here. If I had been given lodging in the city, I would have been killed. If I had my donkey braying in the middle of the night, they would have found me. If I had my chicken, clucking in the middle of the night, they would have found me. If I had my candle giving light, they would have found me. So all the bad things that happened actually conspired to save my life. He looked at everything and said it's all for good. So bringing it back, and I'm sorry for that tangent, I didn't really plan on, but they're good stories, is that Zechariah says in chapter 8, he says all these 4 fast days will be days of celebration. They'll be days of great joy. Why? How? Because in the end of time, and we're not quite there yet, but at the end of time, we're going to have the perspective to see how all the tragedies that occurred to us were really for our benefit. And when we're able to see actually the kindness and compassion that we can't see right now, when we see that in God's hand, we're going to say, oh my goodness, God, thank you for that. So, for example, I just thought of a story and I totally forgot it. So I'm going to say a different story instead. My Rebbe, my teacher, Rabbi Zachariah Wallerstein, he recently passed away, unfortunately. But since he passed away, I've been very nostalgic. So I've been listening to a lot of his lectures, and he told a story. He told an incredible story of how there was one time that he was putting together this fundraising dinner, and usually he had something like 800 people at this dinner. And somehow 2 weeks before the dinner, he ended up, there were only 70 people RSVP'd to come. And he said, I have all these reservations made. I have thousands of dollars invested, or, however much money invested, tons of money invested. If I only have 70 people come, it's going to be a huge disaster. How am I going to get all the people to come that haven't come yet? What am I going to do? And he's very, very worried that this whole thing is going to be a big disaster, a gigantic loss. So, long story short, he meets another rabbi. He's telling him his troubles. And the rabbi says, let me tell you a story. He says, there once was a man. He was a farmer. And he heard a voice call out from him to heaven. And he said, Yankel, outside on your field, there's a big giant boulder. I want you to push it with all your might. I want you to push it for half an hour. And Yankel goes out into the field. He finds this boulder and he's pushing on it for half an hour. Nothing happens. And God says, okay, you pushed enough. The next day, God says, go push it again for half an hour. And he goes and he pushes and he pushes and he pushes and nothing happens. And God says, okay, that's enough. And he does this day after day after day. And he's wondering, why am I doing this? It's not doing anything. One day he comes outside and he sees that the Satan is there. Satan, the angel Satan is there. And he says, you are such a fool. I can't believe you're doing this crazy thing. And the guy says, what do you mean? God told me to do it. He says, you know why God told me to do it? Let me tell you. Because we angels, we work really hard all day and we need a break. And so we petition God, we need a break. We need some comic relief. So he said, okay, I'll get you some comic relief. I have this foolish guy named Yankel. I'll tell him to push a rock for 30 minutes a day. You could just laugh at him. So for 30 minutes while you're pushing this rock, accomplishing nothing, we're all laughing at you up in heaven. And Yankel is so upset. And so the next day God says, go push the rock. And he says, you go push the rock, God. I know what you're doing. You're just making me waste my time, whatever. He says, I had enough of this. And so Yankel, God says, just one more time. And he goes and he pushes. He says, okay, one more time. He pushes it for 30 minutes. And the next day God says, okay, I want you to push the rock. He says, no, I'm not doing it. And he goes, I'm going to go do something else. And he walks into town, and he's so upset, like, why did I waste my time every day pushing a rock for 30 minutes, wasting my time? I could have been more productive. And suddenly this woman, she starts screaming, help me, my baby is caught underneath this wagon. This wagon fell on top of my baby. Someone help me, please. And you have all these guys trying to lift it, and it's too heavy. And this baby's trapped underneath. And your uncle comes over and he goes, everyone step aside. And he lifts up the wagon and he tosses it aside. And they say, how do you have such superhuman strength? Where did you get the muscles to do that? And he realizes that for months and months he was pushing and straining against this rock, and he was building the muscles in his arms, the muscles in his back, and it was for that purpose that God was preparing him, that he was able to help someone else. Now Rabbi Wallerstein used this as a parable to say, now in the end of the day, what did he say? The guy who told him the story said, your job is to push the rock, my job is to make things happen. He says, Wallerstein, make your dinner. He's just telling you push the rock. God's going to take care of the rest. And whatever he did, ultimately he said in the end, he had the biggest dinner he ever had, 950 people. It's a whole story, incredible. But this idea that, God says, you push the rock, I'll take care of the results. It's a little bit of a different lesson, but it also teaches that the hard things that we go through now, we don't realize the payoff later, and we can be very upset in the moment. But when we get down the line and we see ultimately what the purpose was, and we might not know today, but when we see the purpose of it, we're going to say, thank God I went through that. Because I went through that, I was able to persevere, and I was able to succeed, and I was able to have this success. I have my own personal story that I won't go into details, but I was once in a terrible job, and I was miserable for a whole year, and it was the worst year of my life, and it damaged me so thoroughly. It was really like hell on earth. And then because of this, I remember I was so desperate to find another job that I took a job in a place I would never have gone, doing something I would never have agreed to do. And it ended up being the best thing I ever did. I loved it. And I would never have discovered those abilities that I had and that part of myself and developed myself in a way that I'm so much better off now, and I'm so much further along now. I'm so much happier now because I ended up in a place I never would have in my wildest dreams imagined to go, except in the desperation that I was put through in the first position. I allowed myself to go to another place to do another thing that I never would have done, and it was the best thing I ever did. I was never happier than after doing that. And I'm not going into particulars, but we could all have that in our lives, that we have a hard time. It looks like tragedy. And Zechariah says these days one day are going to be days of joy. The Jews are going to be celebrating on the fast days in the end. We have to look at the adversity today as Gamzu L'Tova. This too is for the good. Everything God does is for the best. If there's one lesson to learn from the spies, Moses said, look and find the good. They turned what was good into what was bad. God says, that's going to set off an avalanche of tragedies throughout history, that what's good is going to turn bad. But rather, if you turn what's bad into what's good, that's what's going to lead to the good things in life. And there's many other examples like this, but that now I spent so much time on that, I have to move on. So that's one important lesson to take away from the sin of the spies, is we have the ability with our perspective to turn what's bad into what's good, or chas v'shalom, God forbid, to turn what's good into what's bad. That's why they say there's two words in Hebrew. One is oneg. Oneg means delight, and nega is another word. Nega means an affliction. The word oneg and the word nega have the same exact letters, except for one. There's one letter that's placed out of order. Oneg, the letter ayin, the Hebrew letter ayin, comes first. Nega, the letter ayin, comes last. And what's interesting is that the letter ayin, the word ayin in Hebrew, which is the same name as the letter, ayin means the eye. It means an eye. So they say, what's the difference between oneg, pleasure, delight, and nega, affliction? It's where you put the ayin. It's where you put the eye. It's how you look at it. You could look at something and make it a delight, or you could look at something and make it an affliction. It's up to you. It's up to your perspective. That's one very heavy lesson that we learned from the spies. Okay, moving on. After the section of the spies, we have the section of the laws concerning the flour offerings and wine libations that are meant to be brought in the temple. And it's so interesting that this section, which begins in chapter 15, is introduced by God saying, when you enter the land of Israel, this is what you're going to do. What do you mean? You just told us we're not going to enter for a generation, and the next thing you tease us with is, and when you enter the land, yes, because there's an immediate consolation. Yes, it's true. I told you there's going to be a delay. I told you there's going to be a consequence that you rejected the land and you're going to reap what you sowed. You will. However, at the same time, I want to console you and let you know this too shall pass, and you will come into the land, and you will enjoy that land. So immediately the section following the episode where God says, your generation will not see the land, is the consolation of, but you will ultimately enter. Your nation will ultimately enter. It is going to happen, and here are the laws you're going to keep when that happens. Then we have the laws also in this section of when you enter the land of something called challah. Challah means that when a Jewish person makes a dough to bake with, if they make a dough of a certain volume, we generally consider it to be about 5 pounds. If they're using about 5 pounds of flour or more, then that dough requires a tithe. It requires a portion of the dough to be separated for the Kohen. Now, nowadays, because we don't properly keep the laws of purity and impurity, we cannot give that portion to a Kohen because it doesn't have the level of purity necessary, spiritual purity, and the Kohen would be forbidden to eat it, but we're also forbidden to eat it. So what we do is we dispose of it in a respectful way. We wrap it and dispose of it, or we burn it. But that, even till this day, a portion of the dough has to be removed when we make a large dough. That is a command that comes out of this parsha. Then we have a section which talks about atonements. If a person committed idolatry by accident, how do you commit idolatry by accident? The Talmud gives a couple of examples that there was one idolatry that was worshipped by throwing stones at the idol. That was the manner of worship, was by tossing stones at the idol. And so if a person doesn't know this, and so he starts tossing stones at the idol because he wants to disrespect the idol, and he shows his disdain by tossing stones at it. And someone says, don't you know you just worship the idol? He goes, oh, yeah, I didn't know. So there's an atonement for that. Another example is there was a deity that was worshipped by defecating and urinating on it. That was the manner of worship. It was very lowly. And there was a person who went ahead and said, he didn't know. And he said, I want to disgrace this idol. He said, how could I disgrace it more than by defecating and urinating on it? And he disgraces the idol in this way, and they tell him, you just served the idol. And he goes, oh my goodness. So there's atonements for accidental idolatry. Those are in chapter 15, verses 22 to 31. And then finally, we have the section of the gatherer of wood. Now, I don't feel like I have sufficient time to address the subject, but I'll do what I can do. The gatherer of wood, the Mekoshesh Eitzim, it says that on Shabbos, on the Sabbath, a man goes out into the field and he starts, it's in the wilderness, but he begins gathering wood, gathering pieces of wood in the wilderness. Now, this is forbidden on the Sabbath as one of the 39 forbidden labors, which is gathering in the field on the Sabbath. We're not allowed to do. So he commits the Sabbath violation, and it says that the people incarcerate him, and they come to Moshe and say, what should we do with him? And God says he will be put to death by stoning. Now, this is very strange, harsh. Now, it's true. The Torah says the punishment for breaking Shabbos is the death penalty. That's not the part that was unclear. The part that was unclear is, what death penalty do we offer him? How do we kill him? In fact, there are 4 different death penalties that are mentioned in the literature. There is the penalty of death by the sword. There's death by burning. There's death by stoning. And there's death by strangulation. These are detailed, and I don't have the time to go into it, but we're informed that this penalty is the penalty of stoning. Now, what I want to say about it is as follows. Rabbis tell us that the death penalty was used extremely rarely. Extremely rarely. People think, you do a sin that says in the Torah death penalty, you automatically get killed. It's not like that at all. In fact, there are very, very strict requirements. It's a very important idea. I want to try to give it across in the next few minutes. There are very, very strict requirements for giving capital punishment. And among them is there have to be 2 witnesses. The 2 witnesses have to be valid witnesses, and the validity of the witnesses also has to align with specific criteria. And if these 2 witnesses see the person do it, it's not enough. They have to also warn the person before he commits the act that it is forbidden. If they didn't warn him before committing the act, 1 witness is not sufficient. Hearsay is not sufficient. Even though a person's own confession is not sufficient. 2, what we call kosher witnesses, proper witnesses, have to issue a warning first. If they didn't warn the person first and he committed the act, he is not liable to punishment in court. It's between him and God. He has to repent, but there's no death penalty issued. Furthermore, if they warned him but they didn't tell him the punishment, if they don't say what you're doing is forbidden and it carries the death penalty, he is not liable to the death penalty because he has the alibi to say, had I known the severity of the punishment, I wouldn't have done it. Had they warned me, I wouldn't have done it. As long as he has an alibi, we do not use the death penalty. Furthermore, they not only have to warn him, inform him of the penalty, but he also has to respond to their warning to say, I heard you, I understood your warning, and I'm choosing to commit the act anyway. If he doesn't respond with a proper response, then he has an alibi. I didn't hear you. They say, we warned him. I didn't hear you. Or I didn't understand you. I thought you were joking. I didn't. As long as he has an alibi, it's between him and God. The only circumstance where a death penalty can be given is that 2 appropriate witnesses warn him immediately before he does it. It doesn't count if they warn him an hour before or a day before, because a lot of things change in the mindset of a person. He could forget. Things change. Has to be immediately before, and they warn him of the punishment, and he responds to them, I heard and understood your warning, and I'm doing it anyway. Now you're going to say, that's crazy. There will never be a death penalty, because who will be crazy enough? Who will be dumb enough when he hears the warning of the witnesses to answer, I don't care, I'm doing it anyway. He'll just do it and not say anything. Here is exactly the point. That's exactly the point. You know who would do this? A thoroughly wicked person, a rebellious person, a person who's hateful towards God. Only he would be so brazen as to respond to the witnesses and say, I understand exactly what I'm doing, and I'm doing it anyway for spite, because he wants to let them know I am in rebellion against God. He is making a declaration. That's the person who gets the death penalty. But anyone else, even if he heard, he understood, but he's like, I don't want to say. You know why a person's doing the sin? You know why? Because he's overcome with desire. That's why. He's overcome with passion. And what he's doing is wrong, and he has to make amends with his Creator. But that doesn't warrant the death penalty. That's just a person who's overcome by his emotions, that he has a desire, he has a temptation, and he hasn't been able to overcome it. He's not sinning in rebellion. He's sinning out of temptation. So the temptation is difficult, and a person has free will, and he has to grapple with it, and he needs to make right with God if he abrogates it. But that's not who the death penalty was designed for. The death penalty was designed for the rebel, designed for the wicked person who declares his wickedness and his rebellion against God. And he's the one who says, I know exactly what I'm doing, and I choose to do it anyway. He is the thoroughly wicked person that the Torah wants to punish with the death penalty. And that's why the death penalty was so rare, because most people, even if they committed a capital crime, did it out of temptation, not out of rebellion. It's the rebellion that the capital punishments are meant to come against. They're meant to dissuade the person with temptation, and hopefully it does dissuade him. But his temptation is not a causation for him to deserve to die, such that we have a statement in the Talmud that if a person would be killed once in 70 years by a court, it would be called a bloody court. That was too frequent of a too frequent of a death penalty given. So just to put in perspective, when we find these chapters about death penalty, this was extremely rare and only in extreme circumstances. I have 1 minute left, which I'm going to use to hit the last point, which is tzitzis. Tzitzis are the fringes that we wear on the edge of on the corner of a four-cornered garment. The Torah tells us to put fringes on these corners, and there should be ideally a thread of blue in there. This is a very special blue dye that comes from a specific sea creature. Over the millennia, we have lost the tradition of what this creature is, and therefore it is no longer normative to put the blue in. You see, my strings are only white. We keep the mitzvah without the blue. If you see some people wearing a blue thread, it's because there are some opinions that we have been able to discover what that creature is. It's by no means a settled matter, and therefore mainstream Orthodox Jews don't add the blue string in, but we wear the white string. And the Torah tells us the purpose of the commandment is that we should see the strings and remember the commandments. It's like a person ties a string around his finger to remember. Yep. So Hashem says, tie strings around your whole body, and wherever you are, you're going to see, and you're going to remember, I have to keep God's commandments. I have a great story to end with. William, do I have a couple more minutes?
Go right ahead.
Please forgive me for going over time.
No worries.
But I want to end with the story. The Talmud tells a story of a man who was overcome by temptation. Temptation. It's wrong, but it's not rebellion. Let's just get that straight. Just I'm going back to he was overcome by temptation. This was a good Torah observant Jew. It says, in fact, he was a yeshiva student. He was overcome by temptation for a certain woman of ill repute who was very famed. She was the most beautiful woman in the world, and it was a very luxurious affair to be with her, and you needed to pay a lot of money, and he puts the money together, and he says, I'm going to do this. I can't hold myself back. I want to be with this woman. And he goes to her abode, and he's about to commit a sin with her, it says. But apparently it seems that as he was disrobing, the words of the Gemara, the words of the Talmud is that his the four corners of his garment, the tzitzis strings, slapped him in the face. They slapped him in the face while he was disrobing. He gets whipped in the face by his tzitzis, and suddenly he comes to his senses and he goes, tzitzis. The tzitzis, it says, are a reminder of all the commandments. How so? There are many reasons given how they're a reminder. With the blue string, it says the blue string was reminiscent of this color of the sea. It was like a sea, blue-green, and the sea is reflective of the sky, and the sky is reminiscent of the throne of God, and that's all meant to get our intellect turned on to make this little calculation. Oh, this color, the sea, the sky, heaven, God. We're turning off the animal instinct and we're turning on the human intellect, and we remember God in our relationship with Him. We say, I serve God, I cannot sin. Another suggestion is that the word tzitzis in numerical value is 600, and in Hebrew, and then every corner has 8 strings. There's another 8, and there's 5 knots. There's 5 knots tied onto the tzitzis. So the 5 knots plus 8 strings is 13, plus the numerical value of the word tzitzis is 600. So it's a reminder of the way of the 613 commandments.
Nice.
But all in all, what it is it's turning on the intellect. Think. You're a human being. You're not an animal. Don't be driven by passion. Be driven by intellect. Remember, you're a human with a relationship with God. So the tzitzis remind us, God says, wear them, He says in this Parsha, as a reminder of all the commandments. So this fellow gets slapped in the face with his tzitzis, and suddenly he remembers, I'm a Jew. I have a relationship with God. How could I throw it all away? And he gets off the bed, it says, and he sits on the floor. And says she gets off the bed and sits on the floor next to him and says, What did you see wrong in me? What did you see wrong? No man has ever resisted me. What blemish did you find in me that you're turning me down? I never had anyone turn me down before. And he explained to her. He said these tzitzis remind me that there's 613 commandments in the Torah that I must keep, and that's more primary to me even than this. And I'm sorry, I have to stop myself. And she says, what is your name? Who's your Rebbe? And where do you learn? What yeshiva do you learn in? I don't know why he gave her this information. He wrote it down for her, and he left. Then the next day she shows up at the yeshiva and she says, I want to talk to Rabbi so-and-so, the Rebbe. And she says, convert me. This is where she says, convert me. And he says, why do you want to convert? What's going on here? And she tells him what happened. And she says, if there's any power on earth, I never met a power on earth more powerful than the lust for what I was in business for.
Nice.
Until I met this man, and he had a power in his life that was more powerful than me. If such a power exists, I want access to it. I want that in my life. If this is what the Torah brings, I want to be part of the Torah. Convert me to Judaism. And it says that she ended up converting to Judaism, and she and this young man were married. They ended up becoming married. So that basically sums up the topics in the Parsha with some deeper food for thought. I'm sorry for taking you over time.
That was excellent.
And William, back to you.
Hey, no, that was great. I really enjoyed it. I mean, it's all really enriching. I love the stories. I love the pieces that you throw in here to kind of give us some more context and ideas. So I had a funny thought on the two witnesses thing. If you ever want to get out of jury duty, just go up there when they question you. You know, did you have any problem, prosecuting somebody if they agree? And I said, well, as long as there's two witnesses. I said, what do you mean? I said, well, the Torah states. And they're like, you're dismissed. So, anyway, funny enough. Thank you so much. It was a great lesson as usual. Looking forward to next week, Hashem willing. And so you should all have a wonderful week. And Rabbi, you as well. Thank you for your time. And we'll see you guys again. I've got another show starting at 7 o'clock tonight. And then I think one tomorrow and then two, something like that. I don't know. We'll find out as we go along. Thank you guys. Take care, Rabbi. We'll see you soon.
Take care.
חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה. אני אתה אתם תמיד כולם ביחד. חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד.